Hello.
Okay. Hello, everybody. We're about to start up again. We have a bunch of empty space up front that we'd like to fill up a little bit. Our next speaker might feel lonely and unloved if you guys don't step up here. Bunch of empty tables right over here. It'd be nice to fill. Thank you, Carrie Jo. Do I have to be nice to you now? Yeah. Okay. Okay, you can go back now. Again, there's some empty spaces. Thank you, Karen. I'll try to stop snarking you on Facebook now. Appreciate that. We almost here? Jeff, you can come on up a little bit. Hey, Catherine, plenty of room up here. Hi, Michael. We got room, one love, right? We're going to go ahead and get started for as we get near the end of this session. Once again, it's really good to be here today. I was really excited to be part of the organizing and planning of this summit. My name is Rick Wilson. I'm with the American Friends Service Committee. That is a social justice organization that was originally founded by the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers, in 1917. We're about to celebrate our 100th anniversary. One thing you should know about our organization is the people who work with it and for it come from a variety of backgrounds. Most people who work for it are not Quaker. AFSC has a really proud history, especially in West Virginia, where we've worked on basic economic issues since 1922, working in the coal fields of Appalachia. Our organization, I'm very proud, Reverend English here has a connection with Dr. Martin Luther King. The American Friends Service Committee was the first organization to publish the letter from a Birmingham jail. They helped arrange for Dr. King to go to India to study Gandhi and nonviolence. They work to help Jewish people escape from Nazi Germany. They have an interesting record of working for peace and social justice around the world. And a big part of our work is taking on the challenge of undoing racism. And, you know, in our understanding of racism, we often, I think especially some people of the paler pigmentation, such as myself, have tended to think of it as having personal bad feelings about people who look differently. And as I hope we've talked about today, it goes a lot deeper than that. There are plenty of individuals with bias and prejudice in our heart, but I hope we've seen that there are bigger structural problems out there, such that even if everyone with bigotry and hatred in their heart would wake up tomorrow and it would all be gone out of their minds and out of their hearts, probably nothing else would change in our prisons, in many of our institutions, in our schools, because it's a legacy of hundreds of years. So the challenge before those of us who really care about social justice is to work to undo structural racism, to work to undo institutional racism. And I think I would be remiss in not talking about strategic racism. And I would define strategic racism as the use of racially based words and messages to gain power, privilege, or profits. I mean, if you think about it, racism was invented to justify the institution of slavery, which was created for profit. Subtle racial signals are used today across our political system to cause people to vote for or against certain candidates. These days, the kind of racism that I think we saw a lot during the last election cycle, it's what's been called dog whistle politics. You guys know about a dog whistle. You blow it, it doesn't make a big sound, but the dogs can hear it, right? In fact, if you blow a real whistle too loud, you might get in trouble for it, like someone did recently in the Charleston area, but it's all too common that people make these coded racial appeals, especially during election time, to generate hatred, to generate policies that actually work against the common good. So anyway, keeping that focus on the bigger structural picture, I am honored today to introduce one of my co-workers who came all the way from Seattle, Washington, Dustin Washington, who I've had the privilege of working with and getting to know these last few months. Dustin's work, to a large extent, is focusing on undoing racism. One of the things that he's done that I'm really excited about is freedom schools for young adults and for teenagers, where they basically begin to take apart these ideas of racism and begin to come up with a plan to take it on and challenge it. And we're hoping to bring some of those freedom schools and some of these programs aimed at undoing racism to West Virginia, because I think we all know we have a lot of work to do here. So without further ado, Dustin.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to thank my colleagues, Lita Shepard and, of course, Rick Wilson, for helping to organize this event, as well as for inviting me out here. Let's give them a round of applause. And I have to also thank Beth in front, who's also a colleague that I just met on my trip out here to West Virginia, but we got a chance to really talk a little bit last night, some today. I want to acknowledge her as well. You know, I spent some time looking over my bio in the program here, and it has me described as a professor, a director of a program, as a trainer, as a manager with the city of Seattle, but most importantly, I am an anti-racist community organizer. And the substance of what I want to talk about today really comes out of the organizing philosophy of an organization called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, based in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the People's Institute is an anti-racist training organization that was started by two African-American men, Dr. Jim Dunn and Ron Chisholm. And both of them have been involved with a lot of different organizing over their life. And what they would find is that when they would go to trainings out of the Saul Alinsky model of community organizing, trainings out of the Midwest Academy model of organizing, but when they would go back to their respective communities, they would find that it was hard to get people from their communities, specifically black people from their communities, to come to their meetings to get engaged with the work that they wanted to wrestle with. And fate would bring them two together around 1979, and they met each other and they really clicked, and they shared their experience. And what they understood is that even though we have had a civil rights movement in this country, even though we have in many ways broke the back of overt and legal discrimination, there was still a lot of work to be done around racism. And they knew that we needed to develop in this country anti-racist organizers with a sound analysis, a sound understanding of how race and racism impacts our life every day. So they created the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And so I'm going to share some of the organizing principles that come out of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, really organizing principles that guide and shape the work that I do in Seattle, the work of the Freedom Schools, and some of the other work that I'm going to talk about as well. And the first principle I want to discuss is the principle of history. And one of the things we believe is that you cannot organize against racism if you do not understand how race and racism was constructed in the United States. And it's important for us to understand, as we talk about race and racism, the race and racism as we experienced in the US, even the notion of race, the notion of human beings being categorized in racial classifications, is a relatively new human experience. If we were able to look back at some of our ancient books, our holy books, if we looked at the Quran, if we looked at the Bible, we would see no description of human beings racially. You might see people described by their tribe, by where they come from, but no description of people in terms of classification of race. So I want to take us just through a short journey through history. And then I want to talk about some of the organizing work that we're doing in Seattle. So if we understand, and I want to focus our history, my history discussion today, on the colony of Virginia. And the colony of Virginia, of course, has an intimate relationship with West Virginia. And I want to first start with the notion that in 1609, the first English came to Virginia. And they came, many of them came seeking land. If we look back in England, there was most of the ruling class in England had taken all the prime land. So you had the gentry that came to own the land, and then you had a lot of indentured servants. Many of those indentured servants came out of prisons, came out of debtors' prisons, were kidnapped, or promised land that they could not get in England. And then in 1619, the first Africans came to the colony of Virginia. 20 Africans came. Now, many of us think that when we came here as black people, as African American people, that we came as slaves. But we weren't in the slavery condition that we would later be in initially in the colony of Virginia or in any of the colonies. So essentially what you had was very few of the ruling class who owned the land. You had many European indentured servants, and you had some Africans who were essentially serving as indentured servants. So people who were working together, cultivating the land. We know the cash crop was tobacco. People were cultivating the land in very hot conditions, very oppressive conditions. You know, we didn't have, they had to clear out trees. We didn't have all the tools that we have now today. They were living in very oppressive conditions together. People that we have come to call white and people that we've come to call black. And because they were living in very oppressive conditions, many times they would escape together. Many times they would revolt or rebel together. And that became the greatest threat to the ruling class at that time. So as we look, there were some very seminal moments in history that took place. There's a man by the name of A. Leon Higginbotham Jr., who was a retired federal judge, and he wrote a book called In the Matter of Color. And through his book, he looked at the early laws in Virginia around race and racism in minutia. And he would lift up something that took place in 1640, which was the case of John Punch. John Punch was a black man, an indentured servant, who ran away with a Scotchman and a Dutchman. And eventually the three of them were caught. But once they were caught, something very differently happened to each of them. The Scotchman and the Dutchman were given 2 years of additional servitude beyond their 7 years of indentured servitude to the colony, but John Punch was given servitude for the rest of his life. And very soon following that, there was a series of laws that were passed that began to intentionally separate out black people and people of European descent. And so as we move forward, and this was talked about by our first speaker today, to 1676, to Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion maybe was one of the most important historical acts that helped shape race and racism as we experience it today in the United States. Nathaniel Bacon was part of the ruling class, and all of the prime land in Virginia had been, along the eastern seaboard, had been taken up. And he really wanted to move westward to get more land. And the governor and the House of Burgess in Virginia did not want him to move westward because at that time they had a relationship with the Native American people that was serving their interests. And so they said no, and Nathaniel was mad about that. So what he did was organize a multiracial army. He had black people, some Native American people, and a lot of poor white people. And they went and burned down Jamestown. They forced the ruling class to the sea. Now later, the English army, the English Navy came and the army came, put down the rebellion, killed a lot of people. Nathaniel Bacon died of disease. And this act of a multiracial army shook the ruling class because they knew they were greatly outnumbered. And if poor people came together and really demanded whatever they want, they would be able to get it. So their greatest problem wasn't so much about controlling poor black people or African people, because there wasn't that many of us yet at that time. Their greatest problem was how do we control the poor white people that were beginning to live out their indentured servitude and that were quite upset about not getting the promise of getting land as they were promised when they came to become servants. So what they began to do is start to create the notion, the concept of whiteness. And it would not be until 1691 that we saw the term white used in any legal document in the colonies. And it was around an Anti-Miscegenation Act. And the Anti-Miscegenation Act simply said that any white person that had any sexual relations with an Indian, mulatto, or a black would be banished from the colony for life. The law also went to say that any white person that attempts to escape or run away from their indentured servitude with a black person will have to serve out the life sentence of the black person. So we can see that if Rick and I, at one point in history, were both oppressed and we were running together, now all of a sudden, the powers that be tells Rick that if you run away with Dustin and you're caught, you're going to serve out Dustin's sentence. Might that have some impact on us coming together? That's a question for the room. Might have a little impact, right? Might give Rick some pause about whether he wants to revolt with me. I gotta go. Exactly. So, as we move forward to 1705, our second speaker talked a lot about the notion of white privilege. And we can see the beginning of white privilege in this country really start to happen right around 1705. And what the ruling class did, they did something that was ingenious. They saw that many of the poor whites were living out their term of servitude. So they began to promise them a few little goodies that, again, would bind them with the ruling class. Number one was the concept of whiteness, that you would begin to see us, the ruling class, and the poor have something in common, and to begin to differentiate their class relationship with poor black people. And what was promised to poor white people once they lived out their servitude was the right to sue in court, the right to vote, the right to own land. And they were actually given, after their servitude, a musket, some shillings, money, and some bushels of corn. So we know what the money was for. We know what the shillings was for, the money was for, and we're clear now that the guns were for clearing the land and moving westward. And to clear the land, you had to clear off people that were here on the land. And oftentimes, when we speak in conferences like this around the country, we seldom acknowledge the land that we are on, the original people that lived on this land. One of my good friends who's Lakota would say, his people would think that there were 200 some million indigenous people on this land before Europeans came. Now we have 2 million. So if we can imagine this room, there's roughly 200 people in this room. Imagine if we turn off the lights and then turn them back on, which is about the span of history, and there was only 2 people left in this room. That's what happened to the indigenous people in this country. So now, as we move forward to 1787, another very important date in the history, or year in the history of the construction of race and racism in this country, will be the year of the ratification of the United States Constitution. And in that Constitution, black people, African people, were considered to be 3/5 of a human being. And that was a direct result of something called the 3/5 Compromise. Now, Southerners wanted to count their slaves as full human beings for the purpose of having more voting power, because we know the House of Congress is you get more members of Congress based on your population. Of course, the North did not want to allow the South to have that level of power within the Congress, so they came together with something called the 3/5 Compromise. Now, we understand at that point in history, black people were not treated as 3/5 of a human being. We were in a permanent state by that time in history of chattel slavery. We were no different than a plow, a donkey, a horse, a mule, a bushel, if you will. But for the purpose of power, by the Constitution, we were counted as 3/5 of a human being. People of Native American, indigenous descent, if they kept their tribal affiliation, were not to be counted by the Constitution. And that did not change until 1924. People that we call Latino or Latina or Hispanic now, of course, weren't included by the Constitution because they weren't here. There was no concept of Latino or Latina at that time. They were in their native land. They were Mexican or Costa Rican or what have you. People of Asian descent were not counted by the Constitution because there weren't any Asian people here of any great numbers. The great historian Ronald Takaki would say that there were roughly 150 Chinese men in New York. So we know by the Constitution, African people were counted as 3/5 of a human being. Native American people were not counted by the Constitution. And the truth is, the ideology was that you're not going to be here anyway. The ideology was genocide for indigenous people. We understand there was no Latino people, no concept of Latino or Hispanic, no concept of Asian. So we would argue that the Constitution, the only people that were considered full human beings by the Constitution would be those that would come to be called white today. Now, many people will say, well, isn't that just white men? And we know that there was a gender dynamics between white men and white women in terms of power. But history, again, helps us understand even that question. Because if we go to the very next act of Congress, the very first act of Congress in 1790 was the Naturalization Act. And what the Naturalization Act said, that to be a citizen of the United States of America, you would have to be free, white, 21, and of good moral character. It made no differentiation between male or female, rich or poor, landowner or non-landowner. Free, white, 21, and of good moral character. And so, as we move further throughout history, we're going to move to 1830, which was a year that President Andrew Jackson was elected president. And Andrew Jackson ran as a populist. And again, there was a lot of ferment amongst poor white people who, again, wanted land. And so running as a populist, his primary election promise was the guarantee of land to poor white people. And the only way that he could give land to poor white people was to remove certain people off of the land. And so when he became president, he passed something called the Indian Removal Act. Now, the Cherokee and many of the tribes of the Southeast gave up their tribal affiliation and attempted to assimilate into white culture. And many of them even actually held slaves and lived as white men. But they were sitting on very fertile land. So the Indian Removal Act passed, and the military began to force indigenous people off of that land in southeast Georgia, the southeast part of the United States. And there was a protest that went on. And this protest of this Indian Removal Act went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they actually said the Indian Removal Act was wrong because of treaties that had been signed. But Andrew Jackson said, they may have come down with that decision, but I'd like to see them stop me from removing these people from this land, which led to something that many of us have heard of called the Trail of Tears, where many indigenous people were marched, or all of the indigenous people were marched into the landmass that we now call Oklahoma and northern Texas, where many, many people died along the journey. As we move forward to 1848, and what happened in 1848 very much shapes the immigration debate that we're having in this country today. And in 1848, we had something called the Mexican annexation. Our country went to war, the United States went to war with the country of Mexico. And after that war, we were able to seize a lot of the land that makes up many of the states that exist in this country that are really at the forefront of the immigration debate. So states like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California, Utah. Many historians will say that was the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the Americas. So if we think about the natural resources, the fertile land that existed. But one of the most interesting facts around the Mexican annexation was the Treaty of Guadalupe de Hidalgo. And in the Treaty of Hidalgo, in Article 5, one of the things it said is that if you own land at that time, that you could keep the land, even though you're now becoming a part of the United States. But what began to happen is you had white settlers encroach on the land with violence and begin to take land. And when people of Mexican descent would go to sue in court, what the courts would say is that you have no rights as a citizen of the United States, going back to the Naturalization Act, because the only person that could be a citizen, or only people that could be a citizen in the United States, would be someone that was free, white, and 21. So many, many people lost their land. So when we talk about immigration today and people kind of invading the United States, many people are coming back to land that was essentially theirs and their family's land. I want to jump forward a few more historical dates. I want to go to 1857. How many people are lawyers in the room? Attorneys. So many of you should have learned about 1857 while you were in law school, and it would be the case of Dred Scott. And Dred Scott was someone who was a slave and moved with his master to a free state. And because he moved with his master to a free state, he concluded that I am now in a free state, I ought to be free. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court came back and said, essentially, they denied his appeal for freedom and said that a black man in this country has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. So now, how does that affect us today? When we see the police shootings in Ferguson, in Oakland, California, all across this country, and never do we see a police officer found guilty for the shooting, killing of typically a black man. We can see still in this country that black people and black men have no rights that a white man or a white country is bound to respect. One of the things we know is that every 28 hours, there's a black man in this country killed by the police. That helps us to see that even in 2014, that a black man still doesn't have the fundamental rights that we ought to have in this country. So now as we go to the Civil War, one of the things we were all taught in school is that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, the great emancipator. But if we are students of history, we understand that that was not his motivation. And he clearly, if people haven't read this book was talked a lot about during Obama's first administration, a book called The Team of Rivals. If you get a chance to check out the book, President Lincoln clearly states that he saw black people as inferior. And he also went on to say that his primary goal was to save the Union. Now, if it meant freeing the slaves would save the Union, then I'll free the slaves. If keeping black people in slavery would save the Union, I would keep black people in slavery. So he made a calculated political decision to free black people, not because of some great humanitarian effort, because it served the interests of saving the Union. So after the Civil War, we would move into what we would call the second construction of race and racism in the United States, or what might be called the Reconstruction era. And for a brief period of time, we saw that black people made some gains. People were able to begin to get education, people were elected to office, but there was quickly a backlash. There was the development, the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, the creation of black codes that would control the movement and every essential right that black people held. And that would carry us up to 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson, situated around a man by the name of Homer Plessy, who could pass for white and sat in a whites-only car and was forced to move out of the car. And as he was forced to move out of the car, he protested against this. In his case, he protested against separate accommodations. And as his case eventually made it up to the Supreme Court affirmed the state of Louisiana and said that it was okay in this country to have separate but equal. And really, separate but equal, the Plessy versus Ferguson case ushered in the era of Jim Crow in this country. And we know we've done good as a country of being separate, but have we ever done good as being equal in this country? So, if we jump ahead to the 1950s and 70s, we will see that we had a civil rights movement in this country. We will see that we had people marching in our streets, lawsuits in our courts, little girls getting bombed in churches, leaders being assassinated, people being beaten, people going to jail. And through those efforts, we were able to, again, break the back of Jim Crow and legalize discrimination in this country. We changed the laws, but we've never rooted out the white supremacy that was embedded in every single one of our institutions. So if we go back to 1787, we can see that the only people that were considered full citizens, full human beings, would be those who have come to be called white. So we must understand that every system and institution in this country was set up during a time of racial apartheid. Every system an institution in this country was set up with a bias for those who have come to be called white. And we as a country have not done the work yet to root out the inherent white supremacy in every one of our institutions. That's why it's not enough to just talk about racial disparities, because we tend to say these systems are broken, but in actuality, they're doing exactly what they were set up to do. These systems in this country were not set up to serve every human being. That's why we can see numbers like by the year 2017, there will be more black men incarcerated in this country than were enslaved at the height of slavery. That's why we can see that poverty in Virginia, 26% of African Americans are poor in Virginia, or 28% of African Americans are poor in the state of West Virginia versus 16% of white people. We can see that in the state of Virginia, the average wage for a white male is $18.21 per hour, and the average wage for a black male is $12.80. And we could go through statistics through every single institution and see that white people are doing better than people of color. So when we talk about structural racism, our work is to get into the systems and institutions in this country and begin to root out the bias for the white supremacy that still is embedded in every single institution in this country. And we have to understand that I know there's a lot of work going on in this state around poverty. We have to understand that one of the most insidious barriers to us building a multiracial, poor people's movement in this country, historically and today, has been racism. Racism has always been used to divide poor white people and poor people of color. And building a poor people's movement has always, from the beginning of this country, what we saw in Bacon's Rebellion, and throughout this country, bringing poor white people, working class white people, people of color together has always been the greatest threat in this country. You know, when we talk about Dr. King, and it's great to be here with a pastor who spent so much time with Dr. King, you know, it was one thing for Dr. King and the civil rights movement to organize for us all to be able to sit at a lunch counter. It was a whole nother thing for Dr. King to begin to organize a poor people's movement and bring poor whites from Appalachia, poor black people from the ghetto, poor Native American people from the barrio, from the reservation, poor Latino people from the barrio, and to take on the government for a poor people's Bill of Rights. That's our belief. Our belief is that that's why he was killed, because he began to connect racism, poverty, and militarism in this country, the three pillars of oppression. So if we are to ever really change the fundamental nature of this society, we have to do it from an anti-racist approach. We have to do it not just from what we think racism is. We have to do it from a common and shared analysis. Because often when we come together and talk about racism, some people will say it's structural. Some people say it's about bigotry. Some people say it's about hate. Some people say it's about being prejudiced. Essentially, we say it's whatever we think it is. And so it makes it very hard for us to come together. It's almost like if you went to the doctor and had a problem with your liver, and they give you 40 different diagnoses of what was wrong with your liver. Would you feel comfortable with that? But when it comes to racism in the United States, it's essentially whatever we want it to be. And that is one of the ways in which racism stays in place. If racism is whatever we want it to be, then we're not able to come together and speak a common language and have a common set of goals and a common understanding that will allow us to organize to change racism. I want to share another principle that I think is very important in terms of anti-racist organizing, and it's a principle that we call leadership development. And I want to use some of the work that we do to highlight how we approach leadership development in Seattle. And it's through our organizing process that we call the Freedom Schools. And our Freedom Schools, in many ways, are based off of the Freedom Schools that took place during Freedom Summer in 1964. And we have Freedom Schools where we bring young people, high school age, college age, and we come and we give them an analysis of race and racism. We give them a history of the organizing that has taken place in this country, both locally in Seattle and nationally, for us to be where we are today as a country. And we begin to equip them with tools so they can take their rightful place as leaders in the anti-racist movement. Then, post-Freedom School, the young people continue on with an organizing group that we call YUIR, or Youth Undoing Institutional Racism. And this is a group, a multiracial group, predominantly young kids of color, but multiracial, that meet once a week where they continue to learn about the prison industrial complex. They learn about racism in the education system. They learn about poverty. They learn about neoliberal economics. They really continue to hone and develop their consciousness. And then the kind of place for praxis for them is an organizing project that we call EPIC, which stands for In the Prison Industrial Complex. And right now, these young people, with supporting adults, because we really believe this work can't be fragmented, it has to be brought together. So we really try to take an intergenerational approach. But what they're organizing around right now is to stop the construction of a new $210 million youth detention center in Martin Luther King County, which is where Seattle resides. And our daily bed count in our juvenile detention center right now hovers around 55. But they are talking about building a new detention facility with 155 new beds, even though we know that juvenile crime has dropped by 15% in King County. So our fundamental argument is that the building of this new facility is a perpetuation of the prison industrial complex. There's right now a feeding frenzy around building this new jail. Who's going to get the development contracts? Who's going to get the new jobs in this facility? A lot of people are standing to make a lot of money off of this, but we believe fundamentally incarceration is the wrong public policy for children. So our argument is that we should spend the $210 million on the front end and address the root reasons of why our children maybe are committing acts that would take them in to the juvenile detention center. We also know that there are great racial disparities in juvenile justice. Black youth make up roughly 8 to 10% of King County, but are 42% of those locked up in King County. So either we are saying that black youth are just more criminal, or there's something wrong with the system. Our argument that there's something wrong with the system. So we are organizing, and we're actually building a mass movement. We have clergy, professors, students, rank and file community members, union people, all coming together to say this is the wrong policy. And as we interrupt this juvenile detention center, we will also interrupt the school to prison pipeline. So through that process, we like to say that the issue is important, but more importantly than taking on that issue, it is through that issue that young people develop and adults develop the organizing skills they need to see the whole picture. Because it's not enough to just take on the juvenile system, because the juvenile system is connected to education. Education is connected to housing. Housing is connected to the economic system and poverty. We have to help our people get a holistic picture of the structural arrangement. But through that process, they are developing a skill set as anti-racist organizers. And I guess just the last thing I'll say, because I know we're short on time, is that in the People's Institute, in the Freedom School work, we believe that our salvation in this country will not come from the rich and powerful. Our salvation will not come from more services and more programs. Our salvation will come when we decide to organize. Change in this country historically has happened when the grassroots, when people come together and push the systems. So it is our job to do what Dr. King said, is to have a new revolution of values, a radical redistribution of power, and a radical shift in the way that the systems and the institutions operate in this country. So again, if I leave you with anything, I want to leave you with the word organize. As a matter of fact, can everybody say organize? Organize. Can everybody say organize? Organize. Say it again one more time, organize. Organize. If we organize, we can change this country. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Beth. Dustin, that was awesome. Thank you. I'm Lida Shepard. I'm also with American Friends Service Committee, and I'm charged with the task of somehow capturing some of the conversations, the discovery, the mutual curiosity, and also perhaps some of the vulnerability that was experienced today in the breakout sessions. And also, most importantly, and I'm going to riff off of what Dustin says, what are the takeaways? And I don't, whether there were some takeaways and specific actions that were spoken about in the breakout sessions, but I want to sort of capture some of those here right now in a second. I want everyone to get out their packet. In that packet is an evaluation form. I cajole you, I implore that you fill out this evaluation form. You can do it while I'm talking. I will not take offense. Please, it's really important. For us to move this forward and to organize, we need to hear from you. We need your contact information. We need to hear from you how you'd like to stay involved. A lot of you are already involved in various capacities. But how are we going to organize specifically around anti-racism work? And so whether you'd like to stay involved by hosting a dialogue in your community, we can help with that. Whether you'd like to help educate and organize young people around anti-racism initiatives, something that I'm really passionate about, please indicate that on your evaluation form. If that isn't enough of just sound rationale for why it's really, really, really important to fill out the form, Linda's going to be going around collecting them just here. Well, and if you don't have one, Linda's there to give you one. So just raise your hand and Linda can bring you one. We're going to be going around and kind of gathering them up in the next 5-10 minutes or so. And also, thanks to the Women's Commission, if you fully complete your evaluation form, you'll be entered into a drawing for a beautiful Blanco vase. So that's enough to sweeten the deal for you. Blanco, oh gosh, Rick, where is Blanco made? Beautiful Milton, West Virginia, home of Rick Wilson. So next I'd like to recognize our facilitators who brought an incredible amount of passion, expertise, and I think just a real curiosity and willingness to go places maybe that they hadn't necessarily gone before. So Trish Hatfield, Sky Kirshner, Paul Gilmer, Tara Martinez, Dustin Washington, Jill Williams, Stephen Smith, Reverend James Patterson, Ricardo Flippin, Rick Wilson, Julie Pratt, and Becky King. Thank you all very much. I want to give you all a round of applause. So just by we'll just kind of go by a show of hands. Raise your hand if you got to know someone today of a different race. Raise your hand if that happened today. Okay. Raise your hand if if there was some laughter in your breakout session. Okay. Raise your hand if you ever felt uncomfortable today. Okay, all right, we'll work on that. And raise your hand if you had a moment that, if something surprised you. Did anything surprise you today, whether it was something you learned or something that you hadn't, sort of a new way of looking at something. Something from the very beginning of sort of being involved in this planning process and also having participated recently in a Undoing Racism workshop. The experience that I had was, and I love that Reverend Patterson, he had like the prop for it, but the experience that I had was very much like I had a new set of glasses to look at the world through, and it changed me, and so I feel like I'm better equipped, not completely equipped, but a little bit better equipped to identify racism where I see it. So I was going to kind of break people up, and I think maybe we're a little tired of that, and we're definitely short on time. But I do want to sort of turn it around. If anyone would like to volunteer to answer the question, share one way that you see addressing racism moving forward. One way that you see that you're going to address racism moving forward. Who's a brave soul who wants to answer that very... Karen? Mm-hmm. So for those of you who perhaps couldn't hear, Karen shared that she'd like to see young people more involved in this conversation and this process, and that is going to be happening. We're actually really looking at the Freedom School that Dustin talked about. We're really going to be looking to have Freedom School happening this summer. And that's not just for youth. I think that's for adults too, or as Rick called it, a freedom preschool for us. Anyone else care to share something? Please. So say that one more time. On December 5th. Wow, so breakout number 5 is going to be meeting again on December 4th to continue this conversation. That's wonderful. That's very concrete. Where is that happening? Okay, a recovery. Come on. All right. And that actually, I was, Kenyatta Grant asked me to share this. This is an event that's going to be sponsored by the Coalition Against Domestic Violence and KISRA. It's a community forum call to action about the connection between domestic violence and the impact that domestic violence has specifically on communities of color. It's happening on November 20th from 5 to 7 at West Virginia State. So just kind of key into that.
Can you please repeat that? I was writing down the
Yep.
last.
So it's on November 20th from 5 to 7 at State. And the room is to be determined. So I would suggest trying to get on Coalition Against Domestic Violence or KISRA's listserv. So, anyone else care to share one more takeaway? Something that's coming up. That's amazing. So there's an organizing meeting already happening next month. Okay. Well, I really I thank you all. This has really been. I think that the most important thing that we can do is just to move forward with a fearlessness to confront racism wherever we see it, whether it's inside ourselves, at our work, at our church, in our neighborhood. And that by building these relationships with each other, based on those relationships, we can organize to really eliminate these inequities that are just holding us back as a state, holding us back as a whole people. So with that, I'm going to call on Reverend English back to the stage. So thank you, everyone. Fill out your evaluation form. Coming around.
And please let us give up another hand for Lida. We have no idea how much work has gone into what she has done in terms of facilitating and training facilitators. Now, this is what I call, in my preacher hat, the none but the righteous crew. You have sustained yourself. You have endured. And I just can't resist using that quote from the book, the race does not go to the swift, but to those who endure to the end. I just couldn't resist saying that, obviously, in terms of the play on race, but also in terms of your endurance. There is one clip that we want to play, and then there's the last clip deals with healing, choosing to heal. It's only 3 minutes, but I wanted to raise this one or use this one at the end, and then use it also to introduce Dr. Reverend and Vice President David Frison. Now he has so many titles that I don't know what to call him. So I've known him for a number of years. He would have been here earlier, but there are a lot of things going on at WVU on Veterans Day. And so he had advised me that he would not get here until late afternoon. But because of the commitment that he has, because of the resources that has come from WVU, we want to acknowledge him and have him to do the closeout following this clip on choosing to heal.
Me.
I like to go see movies. Everybody knows I'm a movie person. But I always go to see movies that aren't they're just fantastic kind of, cinematography stuff. I don't want reality because I deal too much with reality. So I deliberately went because at this particular time it was King Kong. My fault, I own it. I go to see King Kong, and the only reason why, of course I had seen it, the earlier versions, but the cinematography for this new one was phenomenal. All the mechanics and all the new stuff. King Kong was doing all kind of amazing stuff. So I decided I was gonna go. So I'm in, I don't know, at Baltimore, I don't know where I am traveling, and I'm with this friend of mine named Dennis. So we go in. I didn't realize the movie was 3 hours. First of all, I had to go to the bathroom when I got in. So I had to get out. So I'm trying to figure out when during the movie do I run out. So I decided it's a big bug scene, Jurassic bugs. I don't like little bugs, certainly don't like big ones. So I decided this is a good time to run out. So I run out. And as I'm running out, this is like the first day opening, so there's like 5 theaters of King Kong. So this guy runs out with his son, white man, he's like mid-30s, and he's got this son, looks about 8 or 10. So they're running out, and I'm going, whoa, that was out of control, the bug scene. He goes, oh boy, was it. I said, yeah, that was clearly the worst part so far. So the father runs in, but his son stops and goes, yeah, I didn't like those black people. And I'm going, why me? Is it me? Do I have like a sign on me, right? And then the kid runs in the bathroom. So I go back in the show and I tell Dennis what just happened, and Dennis falls out laughing. He goes, Joy, this only happens to you. And I'm going, but because there's a scene where and here's the thing about it, this is so amazing about the scene. There's a scene of cannibals, but they're not black people. They're all kind of people, and right now they got to be politically correct. So you had Asians, and they zoomed in so you could see even the main character was a blonde woman with blue eyes. But they physically were all black, even though they represented different ethnicities, because, they couldn't have all black people, and they're not in, this age. So, but the little boy, he couldn't see that subtlety. So I'm sitting there, now I'm upset because I couldn't process. And Dennis goes, Joe, you can't process this. It's over, it's done. There are thousands of people. You're never going to be able to fix this, right? So I'm sitting here, I'm messed up for the rest of the movie. So the movie is over, we walk out, and there are droves of people coming out. And who do you think is standing there leaning on the rail? Was this man and his son. And I say, Dennis, this is he goes, no way. I said, yes, Wade, that's him. So I walk over to the man and I said, do you remember me? He says, yeah, you ran out during the bug scene. Well, they were waiting for the daughter to come out of the bathroom. That's why we were leaning, waiting at the room. I said, can I ask your son something? He says, certainly. So I say to the little boy, I said, now that you've seen the whole movie, because, King Kong bites it in the end. I'm figuring that's pretty bad. I said, what do you think the worst part of the movie was now? He goes, those black people. And his father goes, whoa. I'm sure. Well, yeah, they were. He was so the father. I said, listen, I know your son's not a Nazi. Don't worry about it. That's not what the issue. And the son runs off. I said, the issue here is that they weren't all black people, but that's his image. Because you see, it wasn't the monsters that were horrific. It was those people were. And that's the image in his mind. And he's so young, he couldn't see that there were actually different groups of people as those cannibals. He only saw black people. And his father, you could just see, was tortured. He says, He says, I don't know. This problem is so big. I don't know if we can ever make it right. And I said, you see, now we're having another conversation, he and I. He goes, it's just so big. I don't know if we can make it right. I said, perhaps. I said, I have to believe that we can. And so his daughter runs out, and now he has a son and his daughter, and he's disturbed, though, you can tell. And he's walking away, and Dennis looks at me, and I look at Dennis, and he gets to the escalator, and he stops, and he takes both of his children, and he turns around, and he walks back to me, and he says, but I will make it right with them, because I can make it right with them. You see, that's where the healing begins, you know. That's where, those moments.
Looking within these books I see, nothing in them rings a bell.
Good afternoon. You know, that's a speaker's nightmare to walk into silence, by the way. My name is David Freisen, and I'm the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at West Virginia University. And it's really my honor to be here to be part of this closeout in terms of the healing process. And as Dr. Washington was talking a few moments ago, I really thought back to really what we are doing at West Virginia University right now. In the words of the law, there's an axiom called the value of a chance. And that is the great structure that is put when you have a chance to do something. But I would like to even to bring that even closer to home from my spiritual background, is that there is a man by the name of Leonard Ravenhill. And he made the statement that opportunities of a lifetime must be seized during the lifetime of the opportunity. And so what you've done today is that, as I look over the program, that you have really done an eloquent job in terms of diagnosing how we got where we are. You've done an excellent job in terms of having the conversations in terms of bias and racism and even unconscious racism and where that has brought us to at this point. But I think our challenge today is, as Dr. King said, where do we go from here? And how do we go from here? Because we have, in this country, we have institutions that have an institutional momentum. And as Dr. Washington said, the institutional momentum is based upon racism. It's based upon class. And it's based upon making sure that class and racism don't come together. So when you look at higher education in the United States, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln, during the midst of the Civil War, there was a man named Dustin Morrill. And Dustin Morrill was a person who understood that education was a key to moving people forward. So in 1862, Lincoln signed the first Morrill Act. And basically, the first Morrill Act said that for the education of the quote-unquote industrial classes, there would be these land grants given so that colleges could be built, or the land could be sold and colleges built throughout this nation. And that was not for people of color, because the great majority of people of color were still in slavery. But Dustin Morrill didn't give up then, and so in 1890, he came back with the second Morrill Act. And the second Morrill Act basically stood for the proposition that either the states would integrate their higher education, or they would start a second land grant that was dedicated to the education of African Americans. And so throughout the South, you can only imagine that the states took the second option, that rather than integrating the 1860 land grants, by the way, the 1860 land grants, highly financed, high momentum, high structure in terms of who they are. But in 1890, then the states, particularly in the southern regions, decided to start the African American schools. The reason that I mention this is that so often we see where we are, but we don't always understand how institutionalized the racism has been. And so the African American schools, many times underfinanced, did an absolute awesome job in terms of reaching into the African American community. But in 1954, there was a case by the name of Brown versus Board of Education, which really stood for the proposition to overturn the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson that said there could be a fiction called separate but equal. But Brown then says, no, that is done away with, but what we didn't do in higher education, we didn't go back and undo those two moral acts. And so what we're attempting to do, what I'm attempting to lead at West Virginia University is the reconciliation of the land grant mission. That's not an easy job. Because all the momentum is, of course, is that if we're going to do something within the underrepresented community, then that needs to be done at the 1890 school. And my challenge to West Virginia University, and my challenge to you in terms of helping us, is this idea of demanding that the 1860 land grants have the same heart, actually the same soul, as the 1890 land grants. And so for the first time in the history of West Virginia University, we have put this idea of diversity at the heart of the institution. The 2020 strategic plan basically says goal 3 is that West Virginia University is going to be a center, is going to, at its very core, embrace the idea of diversity and inclusion. And all I needed was the value of a chance to push this university in ways that we've never been pushed before. And I think it's very important because you have to understand that West Virginia University is a Tier 1 university. It has a total budget of almost $3 billion. It has a full service law school, a full service healthcare facility. It has a full service and top tier engineering school. But when you look at the numbers of people that it has reached over the years, it has not traditionally reached in to the underrepresented community. And so what we're doing now is that I have 2 big, hairy, audacious goals. You know, I had to have 2. The first big, hairy, audacious goal for what we're trying to do at West Virginia University is to change the external opinion of WVU and West Virginia. And as a lifelong West Virginian, as a native West Virginian, you know what they think about us. They think, first of all, there's no diversity here, right? They normally don't think there's much education here. And some people don't think that we have teeth here. And so what we need to do is to remind the rest of the country that throughout our history, West Virginia has not been the tail, it's actually been at the head. So when you think of all of the different levels of progress in this nation, West Virginia has always been in the game. I got ready to say, somebody ought to say, man, I'm talking up here. Because people don't seem to realize that when you talk about African American education, you have to talk about Booker T. Washington, West Virginian. When you talk about Black History Month, you have to talk about Carter G. Woodson from Huntington. When you talk about the end of apartheid, you have to talk about Reverend Dr. Leon Sullivan. So on and on and on. Again, the belief about us is just not true. And so what we're trying to do is to change the outside understanding of who we are. But that's only half of the problem. Because while we try to change the outside perception of who we are as a state and as a university, the second big, hairy, audacious goal is that we have to change the reality of who we are. Because there is a lot of work to do here. There is work to do in terms of healing. There is work to do in terms of how on earth could you have in 2012 a convicted felon in jail in Texas receive 40% of the Democratic vote. So that's a reality that we face. We can heal, but we have to heal in a way that is honest, in a way that is true. So what we're endeavoring to do with the Division of Diversity is to take the university into places that we've never been before. Let me give you 3 or 4 quick examples of ways that we're taking this 1860 land grant with the heart of an 1860 and what I now believe the soul of an 1890. So for instance, we are on the west side of Charleston. We are intimately involved. We have our School of Public Health that is intimately involved in recovering the west side of Charleston, which is actually the largest mass of underrepresented people in this state. We have, in addition to our School of Public Health, we also have our School of Education and Human Services on the ground, dealing with those underperforming schools in the area. In addition to that, we also are in our Charleston division. I think the doctor was here, the dean was here. We are looking at placing doctors here as part of their matriculation to be on the west side of Charleston. Now, because I think it's important that we just not leave this in an area where we have come together and have a wonderful discussion, but don't have a plan for tomorrow. And so my challenge for you, after this wonderful day that you have had, what do you plan to do with the issues that we have right here, right now? I would suggest that we don't need another meeting. And in fact, after the 2020 strategic plan was set, I didn't call another meeting for the constituencies at West Virginia to start doing the work, because I think we get kind of paralyzed with our analysis. We need to do what you've done today, and I honor you, Pastor English, and all of those that have been involved. But I would hate for anyone to leave here with not having a specific plan of something you're going to be involved in tomorrow. Don't shout me down with amens. And I'm not suggesting that you need to have another conversation tomorrow. I'm suggesting tomorrow that in this city, that perhaps tomorrow you need to go to the west side and see how you can help. Perhaps tomorrow, if you're from the Eastern Panhandle, perhaps you need to go to the Eastern Panhandle and see how you can be involved tomorrow. Finally, I think it is very important for us to expand our conversation, because this is very comfortable, very neat. Because as I look among you, you are some of the nicest people I think this earth has. The challenge is there's a whole lot of not so nice people that need to be involved in the conversation. And one of the things that I have done, I actually got a Facebook post. I probably shouldn't tell you I'm talking about Facebook, but I got a Facebook post the other day where a guy challenged me because I go on Hoppy Kercheval's show. And he said, well, you know, you really shouldn't go on that show because that station carries Rush Limbaugh, and anybody that carries Rush Limbaugh, we shouldn't have anything to do with him. My challenge is that we can't keep, I almost went to preacher mode. We can't keep talking to the saved. We got to talk to the lost. And we have to challenge them in ways. Challenge them in ways that goes to the very core of their being. And many times people have opportunities to challenge within your sphere of influence. Finally, I think it's very important for us to take the risk to do the right thing. Let me say that again. I think it's important for us to take the risk to do the right thing. Because many times the risk to do the right thing might put you in a situation where you aren't so popular in higher circles. One of the things that I told our president, President Gee, was that one of the things that I have dedicated myself to do is to have the same conversation when I'm at the table that I had when I wasn't at the table. To have the same challenging mentality of challenging the status quo when I have the ear as when I didn't have the ear. And so my challenge for all of us is that we need to summon up the courage to take the risk, and it really is a risk. There is a risk to do the right thing, to take the risk to have the hard conversation, to question why is it so difficult sometimes for us to follow black leadership, to take the risk to ask why is it that we allow gentrification, to take the risk to call upon our political leaders, whether they be Democrat or Republican. And I think it's very important to say both of those, because after the last election, the conversation is changing, the people are changing, but the conversation needs to say the same. And we need to challenge our political leaders. And so how do we heal? we heal by taking the trajectory of institutions such as West Virginia University and challenging that well-financed, that well-educated, that well-situated institution into the community, because you understand that WVU belongs to you. And in fact, our motto is, there is a place for you at WVU. And I mean that not just in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of bringing underrepresented groups to the campus, but also to take the land grant mission out throughout the state. So I hope you take my challenge seriously. And finally, I think we need to stand up for everyone and not allow those that have been oppressed to not stand together. So it's just as important for the conservative religious leader to stand with the LGBTQ community and stand up in your church and say discrimination is wrong. It's just important for the white clergy to say that anytime that anyone is being mistreated, then that is a part of us all being mistreated. It's important that when we look in terms of how we use our assets, that the challenge is that until all of us are completely free or have complete access to freedom, none of us are truly free. And so I congratulate you on this day, but I also challenge you for tomorrow that the chances that we have, that the opportunities that we have may very well be fleeting. So the opportunities of a lifetime that we have right now must be seized during the lifetime of the opportunity. I thank you very much.
You can even remain standing because I'll be just that short. First of all, just to remind you of how the afternoon program and the speakers for the last two speakers really reminded us of what we have here on the external and the institutional challenge that Dr. Friesen has suggested that we consider, as well as previous speakers, and how we have come through that in terms of the internal bias and privileges that we dealt with last night and this morning. So it's a good swing that includes the whole. I wanted to announce that several people have asked about the availability of Cracking the Code. If you would go to their website, there are at least 3 options there. One, you can stream it for about $5, I think. Other, you can buy it on the basis of whether you're purchasing it individually or for an organization. And there are some different ranges of costs that are related to that. So it is available online, and even some of the clips that you have seen are available on YouTube for free. So you can go to YouTube, put in Cracking the Code videos, and some of the personalities and stories that you have seen will pop up for that. And you can download the facilitator guide. Thank you. All right. And last, there will be a kind of a review by way of an article that I wrote, and by the invitation that Ted told me, the Daily Mail invited that we would have a article or op-ed piece, and so I've been assured that it'll be in the Daily Mail tomorrow too, and the title is going to be Race Matters. Really? Just inspired by that. All right. I want to thank you for a grand and glorious occasion that all of us will remember for a long time. And I just want you to stand as I say this together, and as we feel it, and as if you would choose to do, just take the hand of the person next to you. And this is something that is a little poem that I carry with me. It simply says, if I knew you as you knew me. Yeah, say it with me. If I knew you as you knew me, and each of us could clearly see the meaning of your heart and mine, I think that we would differ less and grab our hands in friendliness. If I knew you and you knew me. Go in peace.